Blah.
We know that Glenn Danzig is a lot of things, guys. He is a lot of things. He's a musician. He's a singer. He's a songwriter. He plays guitar, bass, drums. He plays the piano. He's a composer. He is a writer. He is a director. He is an actor. He was a record label owner and runner. He's a graphic artist. He's a photographer, and he does illustration. He runs a comic book company. He's an art dealer. For better or for worse, he does it all. It's really kind of weird to think that Glenn Danzig was also a movie critic. That's right. Glenn Danzig, for a period of time in the early 80s, wrote these tiny little movie blurb reviews for Flipside Magazine.
If you don't know what this one is, what the fuck you doing here?
Here we go. We're talking about Dawn of the Dead. If you're going to go see Dawn, because for some strange reason you've never seen it, or just for another view, forget it. It's been cut to shit so it could get an R rating and play with the ultra boring creep show. Has Romero sold out? We'll see when the last of the Living Dead sequels is out. Supposed to say sequels. Wow, so he is just hating. So, interesting story. When Dawn of the Dead was being made, they did not pull any punches. Dawn of the Dead was just made to be incredibly gory. Tom Savini is finally in the mix, and he has carte blanche to do whatever he wants, and George is just letting him do it. They're shooting in the Monroeville Mall, who are friends with George, you know, the owners of the mall. They're like, you could do whatever you want. So they are just going for broke. Every conceivable gore gag that they can think of, they're trying to pull off. By no stretch of the imagination, Dawn is a very small film, even though its budget is, you know, over 10 times what Night of the Living Dead, 15 times the budget of Night of the Living Dead. It was made for $1.5 million, and it made a lot of money. And when they were ready to release it, they knew that after what had happened with Night of the Living Dead, the MPAA, which, you know, issues its ratings, was not going to give Dawn of the Dead a pass. And the reason why was because of Night of the Living Dead. See, Night of the Living Dead is the reason why films are rated R. One of the reasons why. People would go to Night of the Living Dead. It was just a drive-through film. Taking little kids, they have no idea what they're in for. The violence, and there's nudity, and you see a little girl take a trowel and stab her mother to death before consuming her. You know, they're eating guts, real intestines and livers and things. And Glenn Danzig talks about this in that unseen interview from my friend when I worked on this documentary called Dead On, The Life and Times of George Romero. And he talks about, and it must have been when he saw it, he probably saw it in 71, Glenn Danzig. And he talks about how people were literally screaming in the theater. And I believe it. I genuinely believe it, because nobody was expecting what they were going to get when they went into that film. They were expecting maybe a B horror film in the same vein of some of the more tamer stuff that was coming out of the 60s. There was not a lot of gore films in the 60s. There's not a lot of films with extreme subject matter. You have to think to yourself that Night of the Living Dead in the 60s is like a Serbian film in 2010. It's like, whoa, Jeff, what are you saying? I mean, you have to imagine what was more extreme than Night of the Living Dead in 1968. There's only a couple of things that come to mind. One of them is Blood Feast from 1963. 1963, that's the first time you see red, bloody gore, removing eyeballs and tongues and things, which, of course, Glenn Danzig is attracted to, is also attracted to Night of the Living Dead. These are the two of the most extreme films. Isn't it funny that Glenn Danzig wrote Misfits songs about two of the most extreme films from the 60s? Now, some might argue, oh, Jeff, there's other extreme films from the 60s, and maybe there are, maybe they don't come to mind. There's only two other films that predate both Blood Feast and Night of the Living Dead that have any kind of level of gore that could be comparable to both Blood Feast and Night of the Living Dead, something that might be Glenn Danzig's cup of tea, and that is Eyes Without a Face from 1959, French film. Probably it's a proto-French extremity film when you think about it, and it literally shows a woman's face come off and get removed, And then the other film would be a Japanese salaryman feature called Jigoku. 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 Probably pronouncing that wrong. And that has scenes of hell. And you see this dude and his whole body. You see all of his organs and like blood and guts. And it was shot in color and it was made in 1959. And as far as I know, that is the earliest depiction, in my opinion, of blood, guts, and gore. Okay? So Night of the Living Dead is a big contender for being one of these extreme movies. So how did censors react? They created the restricted movie. And it wasn't just Night of the Living Dead. There were other movies, too, that were the impetus for this. But Night of the Living Dead was a big one, where for the first time, parents were caught in this situation where they were bringing children, they were bringing people underage to see something that they thought was more innocent than it actually was, and turned out to be quite the scary gore. I mean, you see a woman with her face eaten off, which Glenn Danzig immortalizes on the cover of Night of the Living Dead. He wrote a song, named the EP after it, and took that art to use for the Misfits. That's how enamored he is by Night of the Living Dead. So now fast forward back to 1978, and Richard P. Rubinstein, the producer, who was a great producing partner for George and helped him make a lot of stuff, and George Romero, and I think maybe Dario Argento was part of Dawn of the Dead as well. He put up money with his brother Claudio. They go to the board, and the board is like, we are going to cut this to shit. We are just going to cut the shit out of this movie. So what does George Romero do and Richard Rubinstein? They say, fuck it. They do the most punk rock thing ever. This is why they're punk rock. And I wonder if Glenn even took a note out of their page, the same sort of trajectory in a way that Static Age, not Static Age, but Plan 9, Bullet. Well, let's say the Bullet EP went. You know, the gatekeeper's not going to let Glenn release Static Age, right? They're like, no one's going to listen to this shit. So what's Glenn do? He goes, all right, I'll start my own record label. I'm going to call it Plan 9. I'm going to put out the Bullet EP with these songs. The song about JFK having his head blown off and his wife, Jackie, sucking off this rich Greek shipping magnate. That's kind of like what happened with George Romero and Richard P. Rubinstein. They said, okay, you're not going to let us release the film as is. You're going to make us cut all this stuff. We shot all this stuff. We're not going to yield. So what did they do? They released that motherfucker unrated. That's right. Dawn of the Dead gets an unrated release, which at the time, and now this is also pre-X, I believe, or maybe X does exist, but X is, when you see X or NC-17, it's associated with pornography. There's no pornography per se in Dawn of the Dead, unless if you consider gore porn. So it's gore pornography. And they're like, an unrated movie that's a kiss of death for any release. When you have an unrated movie, at least at that time in the late 70s, you can't take out newspaper ads. It's the same thing in the 50s with the EC Comics and the Comics Code. The EC Comics went under. They couldn't survive because, you know, the Comics Code forced them. You know, they couldn't do the things that they were doing in comics anymore. So they went under. Then they get the rise of Mad Magazine instead. Well, Richard P. Rubinstein and George Romero go, fuck it, we're going to do it like this. They did one screening in New York City. They four-walled it. What does four-wall mean? It means you rent out the theater yourself. You buy every seat in the house, which is very expensive. It's the same as putting on a DIY show. You know, bands pooling their money, renting out a hall, and then putting on a punk rock show themselves, entrepreneurial-like. And so that's what Richard and George did. And people saw it, and the word of mouth exploded because at the time, you know, media was different there, and word of mouth was everything. Word of mouth is everything today, but word of mouth then, like, you lived and died by word of mouth, and people were like, holy crap. George Romero just did it again. He did the same thing that he did with Night of the Living Dead, but now it's in color, and it's so much gorier, and it's great, and as we all know. And so that's why Glenn, that's my long-winded reason as to why Glenn is saying, forget about this Creep Show and Dawn of the Dead double feature because they've cut Dawn of the Dead to ribbons. I would never watch a rated R version of Dawn of the Dead. You couldn't pay me money. You have to see it unrated.